The central figure in the savings and loan scandal, few people outside the state of Arizona or the U.S. Congress had ever heard of Charles Keating, Jr. Keating was the owner of Lincoln Savings and Loan, the most spectacular of nearly 300 S&L failures. In his dealings have tarnished and maybe ruined the careers of some of the country's most powerful senators. When asked earlier this year whether his financial contributions influenced politicians to take up his cause, Keating responded, "I want to say in the most forceful way I can, I certainly hope so." That not only gives insight into the man, but also into what's been called the biggest financial disaster since the Depression.
We think that the boom here is unending on into the 2000s. It's everything you could ever want. The opportunity just was here. And here the area is so big now and so prosperous that it just can't miss.
Charles Keating was talking about Phoenix. And in May of 1986, when he gave the camera a rare inside look at his $4.5 billion empire for an independent documentary, he was riding high.
That's real steel, rebar, and that's real concrete, and that's real dollars. Real people are going to spend real money in there. No dream in that.
He'd gone from being the most successful home builder in town to one of the most prominent citizens in the Southwest. A swashbuckling entrepreneur with interest in hotels, land, and as every employee knew, a savings and loan.
Savings and loan is a big deal because it's a source of funding for all these projects. It's a way to transfer money into these other divisions and support projects like the Phoenician.
All of a sudden you've got cash that you can play with.
Right, exactly.
Actually, we consider this a financial business. That's basically, I guess, if you had to describe what we're in, you'd say the financial business.
Keating was a champion swimmer, a philanthropist, a crusader against pornography with political ties that went straight to the White House. Aggressive, charismatic, and above all, generous.
Why don't you tell them what you got paid last year? What's the proxy show? It's public information.
Probably around $800,000 last year. And then if you put stock options on top of that, it goes up from there.
Yeah, which we did.
Which we did.
He made his top executives millionaires and paid his secretaries like executives.
Marie, we would probably have, I would think, the highest caliber girl in town. They stand in line to come to work here. It's probably because of the pay. Their pay for secretary, we try and spread that around town, would be in the 50,000 range.
And as if he needed to document his generosity, he offered this executive, who started as a secretary, a healthy raise right on the spot.
Come on in here. Come on in here. Come on in here. Now, okay, have you ever asked me for a raise? Come on, turn around here. Come
No.
on. I'll do something for him. Have you ever asked me for a raise?
Never.
No. How old are you now?
31.
31. Okay, you're going to be the first girl that started off as a secretary to make $100,000.
In what year?
In
1990.
We'll start you right now. Raise you to $100,000.
Gosh, we better get Bob in here. He's the president of the commercial division. I'm not sure he's going to be receptive.
But
to
you know
that.
I'm serious, right?
Yes, that's the way things happen around here. Mr. Keating just decides to do something on the spur of the moment, and all the employees are so well taken care of.
Where did all this money come from? To find out, we showed the tape to Bill Black, a lawyer with the Federal Office of Thrift Supervision. It was his office in San Francisco that sent out the first warning signal on Charles Keating.
What does the tape show you about Charlie Keating?
Well, it shows you that he's very free with our money.
Our money?
Money wasn't coming from him. The money was coming from the depositors, and it was coming from retirees who were ripped off on sales of what's called subordinated debt, uninsured deposits.
So this $25,000 raise that this young lady just got?
To impress a visiting cameraman. I think it's obvious if you watch that, it was just showing off, as we used to say in my neighborhood.
But that came from the deposits of Lincoln Savings and Loan?
That's right, and the deposits, all of us as taxpayers.
Insured by the federal government?
That's right. Because of insurance, it's we as taxpayers who provided that money.
When Keating bought Lincoln Savings and Loan of Irvine, California in 1984, the institution was healthy with assets of $1.1 billion. The government had lifted all restrictions on how its deposits could be invested, and it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
It's unlimited.
So Keating, like many other big-time investors who bought savings and loans during the Reagan years, used it as a private piggy bank for his own ambitions, like the Phoenician Hotel, which cost $500,000 per room to build.
It's by far, I think, the more expensive resort hotel ever built in the continental United States, and it rivals anything in Hawaii. We're trading to make a profit, bottom line profit. We don't do much that doesn't aim toward the bottom line.
Keating took Lincoln's depositors out of sound, conservative investments like home mortgages and began running the savings and loan like a high-risk venture capital company. The only difference was his risks were insured by the federal government.
They did a little bit of everything that was wild and wacky. They speculated in foreign currency. Let's decide whether the yen is going to go up or the dollar is going to go down.
This is Shelley Weiner. Shelley's our main money man.
And we follow all the markets, futures markets, cash markets, currency markets.
If Shelley Weiner here looked a bit pale and uncomfortable in front of the camera, there may be good reason.
They lost $11 million in foreign currency speculation.
Is that a risky investment?
It's one of the riskiest possible.
You think they were in trouble even at the time that Charles Keating was giving this tour to the camera?
I think economically they had failed at the time he was giving that tour.
We don't do much that doesn't aim toward the bottom line.
To get some sense of why Lincoln ultimately failed, Bill Black, who's been investigating it for years, says you need some sense of who all was running the place.
This guy over here is my son. He's in charge of land development. They would have probably under his control about $500 million worth of land, and actually he's the largest profit center in the company.
Charles Keating III, was he the profit center of the company, and was he competent to be running a $500 million business?
Well, no, that was the loss center. That was the leading loss center at Lincoln Savings. C3, as he's known in Phoenix, is somebody who's only worked for his dad, age of 26 or something like that, becomes president of major land development subsidiary. Eventually, he's making over $1 million a year.
Were there other members of the Keating family, other relatives that were on the payroll?
Most of the family was on the payroll. Altogether, from 84 to 88, through various ways, they received about $44 million from the holding company in Lincoln Savings.
The family?
The family alone.
But the Keatings put most of the money from Lincoln Savings and Loan into raw land.
This is the biggest piece. It's 20,000 acres in southwest Phoenix, and that'll end up being a city of about 100,000 people.
This is what it looks like today. 20,000 acres of sand and cactus. There's a road system which looked impressive on the helicopter tours that Keating used to give to potential investors and visiting congressmen. And at ground level, there are a few signs. This was supposed to be the 18-hole championship golf course. There are a couple of houses out here, but by and large, most of the inhabitants are coyotes and jackrabbits. Out in the middle of nowhere, federal auditors say it would have taken well into the 21st century for this to become a viable development.
It was just a little bit too far ahead of the market. In fact, it was a lot too far ahead of the market.
Phoenix Mayor Terry Goddard says Charles Keating usually got his way, with the help of $500,000 in campaign contributions handed out to Arizona politicians during the 80s.
How would you characterize his involvement in politics here?
A little like a bulldozer. It was an involvement that was just too prominent to ignore. I called it one of the powerful few, but he's kind of boiled down to the powerful one.
Not even the people in Arizona realized just how big Charles Keating was. His influence reached into some of the most powerful offices in Washington. His generosity was not limited to campaign contributions. When federal regulators tried to make Lincoln cut back on its risky investments about 6 months before these pictures were taken, Keating offered a job to his main adversary, Edwin Gray, the chairman of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board.
We set up an entrapment procedure whereby my chief of staff actually met at breakfast with Charles Keating himself. And yes, he said, he confirmed that he wanted to hire me. He needed somebody like me, you know, to deal with the government. And I later found out that the Treasury Undersecretary George Gould later said that Mr. Keating bragged to him that they were going to pay me $300,000.
It's a good job.
So I found out how much I was worth, at any rate, later on.
Where does that $300,000 stack up?
Well, it's certainly not nearly as much as Senator Cranston was able to get out of Mr. Keating, which was almost $1 million. I'm not saying that went into Senator Cranston's pocket, but that's how much he was able to get from Mr. Keating, American Continental, Lincoln, for Mr. Cranston's causes and his campaigns and so forth.
California Democrat Alan Cranston was not the only powerful senator to benefit from Keating money. Arizona Senator John McCain received $112,000 in Keating contributions and $13,000 worth of vacation trips. Arizona Senator Dennis D. Concini, $48,000 in contributions. Don Regal of Michigan, the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, received $76,000 in contributions. Senator John Glenn and his causes, $234,000 in contributions from Keating interests. All of them would intervene directly in Keating's behalf, trying to get Bank Board Chairman Gray to back off. In April 1987, minus Regal, the senators would request an extraordinary meeting.
I was told to come alone. I did.
Did you find that unusual?
Absolutely. Never happened before. The senators didn't have any staff with them either.
Why is that significant?
Oh, because it never happened. The whole time I was in Washington, I never saw that. And
no witnesses?
No witnesses. Deniability. Perfectly built into the meeting.
What was going on there?
Well, this was a show of force. I guess, were hopeful that they could change my behavior.
What is going through your mind now about Charles Keating?
Money. Charles Keating's money.
It took 2 more years before the federal government finally seized Lincoln Savings and Loan as unsafe and unsound, a delay that, by some estimates, cost taxpayers nearly $1 billion. Keating's desert development is now part of a $1.1 billion racketeering lawsuit, the largest civil bank fraud case in history. The Phoenician Hotel is open for business and every bit as spectacular as Charlie Keating dreamed it would be. Only now, it's run by the federal government. And Keating himself is finally stopped talking, except through his lawyers. His company is in bankruptcy, and he's suing the government, claiming everything would have turned out all right if the regulators had just left him alone. And it's still unclear whether he or anyone else has done anything illegal or where the responsibility lies.
The opportunity for this type of thing is unbelievable.
We have a $300 billion savings and loan crisis today because money paralyzed the Congress into inaction back when the Congress could have done something about it. It came from many sources, and the Congress did nothing. Absolutely nothing.
But it wasn't just Congress. For years during the Reagan administration, federal regulators permitted and even encouraged high-flying savings and loans to make risky investments and to avoid the day of reckoning. And it wasn't just Charles Keating. There were a lot of others out there doing the same thing. His failure represents just 1% of the hundreds of billions of dollars it may eventually cost the American taxpayer.
There's never been enough. For 40 years, Rudolf Hess was a prisoner in Spandau jail in West Berlin. The last surviving top Nazi, he had been sentenced to life imprisonment by the Allies at the end of World War II. In later years, as he grew older and frailer, there were campaigns to free him on humanitarian grounds, but the Russians always vetoed any release. Then in early 1987, there were signs that under Gorbachev, the Russians were about to lift that veto. But Rudolf Hess never lived to see freedom. He was found dead in prison just a few months later in circumstances that for some were just too much of a coincidence. Here in the cemetery of a small town in the Bavarian hills of Germany lies the grave of Rudolf Hess, once a minister of the Nazi Third Reich and deputy to Adolf Hitler. Much of Hess's life was shrouded in mystery, and now it seems his death was shrouded in mystery too. Officially, it said he committed suicide, But to some, there is growing evidence that on the 17th of August, 1987, the 93-year-old Rudolf Hess was murdered. From the start, Rudolf Hess was a devoted Nazi. He was Hitler's right-hand man, never far from the Führer's side. But in May 1941, in one of the most bizarre and still unexplained episodes of World War II, Hess flew alone to Britain, parachuting from his plane before it crashed. Churchill ordered his internment, and he was never again. At Nuremberg, where he was sentenced to life imprisonment, he pleaded loss of memory and gave nothing away. For the next 40 years, Hess was kept in Spandau prison in West Berlin, the last 20 of those years as Spandau's only prisoner, condemned to solitary confinement and forbidden to write or speak about his past. He died here in the prison garden where over the years he'd spent so much time. Authorities said Hess committed suicide in the summer house there by hanging himself from a window with an extension cord that belonged to a reading light.
How does he commit suicide? He can't even see well enough to see his shoes or to tie his shoes. They had to be tied for him. He couldn't get his hands open.
Colonel Eugene Byrd is a former American commandant of Spandau who knew Hess well.
Now, to hang himself, he would have to get up from this bench, bend over, pull out the socket out of the wall, take it out of the lamp, tie a knot in it. Or this man couldn't raise his hands and his arms above shoulder level. This old, decrepit man that could not hardly get up on his own. It just doesn't stack up.
Do you think it was murder, Colonel Byrd?
I certainly suspicion it. Simply based on the age of the man and the circumstances surrounding it. I don't think it was suicide.
At the time of his death, Rudolf Hess was the most closely guarded prisoner in the world. The four powers, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, rotated each month guarding the exterior of the prison. In August, when Hess died, the Americans were in charge. Inside, there were British, French, and American civilian guards, or warders as they were called. But of all the people who were at Spandau that day, only one is prepared to talk about what he saw. Abdullah Malawi, a Tunisian, was Hess's nurse for 5 years. Malawi says he was having lunch just outside the prison when he received a telephone call from the French chief warder telling him to come quickly.
Komm. Ich bin sehr schnell. I rushed to the main gate. I rang the bell and waited. But the British guard on duty there just looked at me and didn't open the door. I waited for about 15 minutes.
After finally being allowed through the main gate, Malawi says he was then prevented from going through the cell block, which was the quickest way to Hess. Instead, he had to go all the way around the garden. What should have taken him 2 to 3 minutes took, he says, 40. When he reached the summer house, he says he found Hess lying on the floor. Standing next to him was an American warder who later said that against standing orders, for a few minutes he had left Hess alone.
The chairs and the lamp had been pushed over. The carpet was all ruffled up as if there'd been a terrible fight.
The lamp extension cord that the four powers said Hess used to hang himself, where was that?
The extension cord was still attached to the lamp.
Plugged into the wall and plugged into the lamp.
That's right.
Although Malawi says he couldn't feel a pulse in Hess's body, he sent for the emergency medical kit that was always kept sealed.
All the seals had been broken and everything inside had been wrecked.
It looked like someone had tampered with it?
Yes, I'm convinced it was done deliberately, because at 8 o'clock that morning I had checked that kit myself. It was all okay then.
Eventually, Hess was put in an ambulance and brought here to the British military hospital where doctors tried in vain to resuscitate him. At 10 minutes past 4, some 2 hours after his nurse had been called, Rudolf Hess was pronounced dead. An official autopsy performed on Hess at the hospital by a British pathologist flown in from London concluded that Hess had died by hanging. But his son, Wolf Hess, by now suspicious of the circumstances surrounding his father's death, sought a second opinion. 4 days after his death, Wolf Hess brought his father's body here to the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Munich, where a second autopsy was performed under police observation by Dr. Wolfgang Spahn, one of Germany's leading pathologists. Dr. Spahn concluded, after examining the body here, that it was almost impossible for Rudolf Hess to have died by hanging. Dr. Spahn found a horizontal mark running across the back of Hess's neck, a mark the official autopsy had failed to report. That mark suggested that Hess had been not hanged, but strangled. But couldn't Hess have strangled himself with an electric cable?
Not possible.
It's not possible.
This electric cable is not possible. Kann ich nachsagen, warum?
And I can tell you why. If you try to strangle yourself with an electric cable, in 8 to 10 seconds, you would lose consciousness. So then the cable would become loose again.
Based on those conclusions, there had to be someone else involved.
That's a matter for the police. That's not my business. I can only say what I found.
Again, forget Rudolf Hess.
Yeah, I forgot.
If this body comes to you in Munich, would you say to the police, hanging or investigate?
Investigate.
But further clues to the death of Hess were impossible to find at Spandau. The prison and the place where he died had disappeared almost overnight. There's not much left of Spandau now. After the death of its last Nazi prisoner, the British bulldozed this place to the ground and are now building a new facility. The first thing to go was the summer house. Within hours of the removal of Hess's body, that house and all of its contents were burned.
There was a plan, in case of death of the prisoner, that all of his private belongings, by that the bedding, his shoes, the clothes he wore, would be burned in the garden within 72 hours. But what amazes me is that this cable that he supposedly hung himself with, and that little hut, was destroyed the very same day he died. Why?
Answer.
I have no answer for that. We destroy the evidence of whatever took place.
But there was one piece of evidence that wasn't destroyed, and that was this note, which begins, written a few minutes before my death. The authorities said it was found in Hess's pocket and clearly indicated suicide. It was written on the back of a letter sent to Hess a month before he died by his daughter-in-law, Andrea Hess.
I can't believe it's true, you know, because there are a few things in that doesn't really fit into the year 87.
For example?
For example, he doesn't mention his grandchildren at all because he was so very much interested in them, and his only hope, and his very strong hope, was until the last minute to see them.
Wolf and Andrea Hess believe the alleged suicide note is a forgery, copied from a real letter Rudolf Hess wrote in 1969 before the grandchildren were born. In that year, Hess was so sick he was convinced he was going to die. For someone to have killed him and for a suicide note to have been forged, take a letter taken from a document he wrote almost 20 years earlier, that has to be a conspiracy that involves more than one person.
I would say even to kill him would involve more than one person, of course.
Ask the four powers here in Berlin about allegations that Hess was murdered, and you don't get much in the way of a response. The French say they know nothing. The Russians tell you to ask the Americans who were on guard that month. The Americans say they'll go along with whatever the British have to say. And the British, they're as tight-lipped and secretive as they've always been when it has anything to do with Rudolf Hess. Documents relating to Hess's flight to Britain here at the Public Records Office in London remain classified until the year 2017, and some in the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle, one of the Queen's homes, may never be made public.
The British government very obviously was not interested to release him because then he could have talked.
But I mean, the British had never seemed to be interested in the past in keeping him in prison. It was always the Russians.
Yeah, officially, all the three Western governments declared for years that they were ready to release him, but knowing that the Russians kept up their veto, it was easy to say this.
But in early 1987, just a few months before his father's death, Wolf Hess says that Russian diplomats told him President Gorbachev had decided to waive that veto.
The Russians said they wanted to get rid of Spandau Prison.
Yes.
And the only way to get rid of Spandau Prison was
to release Rudolph Hess, of course.
You believe the British had the best motive to murder your father?
Rhodri Morgan is a British member of Parliament who also believes the British had a motive to murder Hess.
And although he was in terrible physical condition, bent over double with arthritis of the spine, he was 100% compos mentis. He could have done, had he been released, massive tape-recorded interviews. So for the first time, perhaps, we would have heard a full account of what happened. Why did Hess arrive? What sort of welcome did he have? Did he think he had a right to expect from members of the British establishment when he crash-landed in Scotland?
Rhodri Morgan reminded us that while Churchill stood firm against Hitler, there were others in wartime Britain who secretly sought a peace with Germany, including the man who, a short time before, had been king. After his abdication, the Duke of Windsor, as he became, openly visited Nazi Germany in the 30s. But there are allegations that the Duke continued those Nazi contacts after war had been declared. In neutral Portugal, the Nazis suggested to the Duke that if Britain accepted Hitler's peace terms, he and the Duchess could be restored to the throne of England.
You could call that treason.
Yes, you certainly could.
I guess corroboration of those stories by someone like Hess is something that the British would go a long way to avoid.
Incredibly embarrassing to the British government, but also to the wider interest of the upper echelons of British society, right up to and including the royal family even today. After all, you are talking about the Queen's uncle. You know, they would go to long lengths to avoid that. Now, whether they would go to the lengths of murder, obviously, is what only a criminal investigation would answer.
Claims that Rudolf Hess had been murdered finally reached London's Scotland Yard. After preliminary inquiry, they recommended a full-scale murder investigation. But that recommendation was turned down by the Crown Prosecution Service, which told Scotland Yard to drop the case. And since then, no one here will talk publicly about the death of Rudolf Hess. His tombstone bears only the simple inscription, "It was worth the risk." But were there those who decided it wasn't worth the risk that the last Nazi prisoner of Spandau should ever come out alive? Along with all the other secrets of his life, it seems that Rudolf Hess has taken one more secret with him to his grave.
If the aim of a professional sport, as is so often said, is to operate as a successful business, the most successful business in American sports is stock car racing. And no one has dominated that sport more than Richard Petty, the 52-year-old millionaire grandfather they call King Richard. When we began this story, we didn't know a lot about King Richard, and frankly, we'd never been to a stock car race, even though it is the most popular and fastest-growing sport in the country. Stock car racing has come a long way from its rural southern roots, when moonshiners raced each other on country roads with souped-up engines. Now it's a $750 million a year business. On almost any weekend, somewhere in America, but mostly in the South, fans turn out to root for their heroes. But 29 of those Sundays are special, because that's when the big boys go at it for the Winston Cup, the World Series and Super Bowl of stock car racing.
Turn number 4, Richard Petty's car goes airborne, end over end. There's 2 or 3 other cars into it.
It may seem like a roller derby with engines, but it's big business, Southern style. With over $18 million in total prize money, the rewards are worth the risks. Petty limped away from this accident with a sprained ankle. He hasn't always been so lucky.
When I had my neck broke, I shouldn't have been driving. I've driven with broke ribs. I've driven with broke feet. I went to the doctor and had a special cast made so that I could use the accelerator on the race car. And, you know, just anything, whatever it takes to do the job. If you really want to do it, then you're going to figure out a way.
Oh, King Richard, you run a stream, the swiftest of outlaws I've ever seen.
It's an attitude that has won him a special place in Southern folklore. 50,000 of his fans turned out in an open house down in Level Cross, North Carolina, to help him celebrate his 30 years in racing. Petty sat on the porch 2 whole days, signing autographs and shaking hands with fans who waited in line 4 hours to meet him. No one complained.
Just meeting him was terrific. It was worth driving 600 miles. I took my wife to our race when he won the 199th race at Dover. That was our first race together. I said, that's it. It's an omen that Richard won our first race together, and we got married about a year later.
Good. That's great. Okay, good. Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Okay. See y'all later.
Some of the things that make Petty such a hero are his 7 national championships and 200 victories, almost twice as many wins as the next guy. It hasn't been easy.
To make the move, Petty gets by Baker, and Schrader gets by Petty. They're door to door. They're sideways. They touch.
They say it's as safe as getting out of the bathtub. But a driver was killed last season, and the walking wounded are everywhere.
A doctor who examined your x-ray said that not only you shouldn't be racing, you shouldn't even be walking.
Well, you know, I've been real fortunate. I've been a quick healer. And at one time there, I ran like 530 or 40 races in a row. And, you know, you're talking 10 or 12 years in a row, not missing a race. And even though I had some accidents and stuff, I was still able the next week to get back in the car and go win some races.
The most exciting part of the whole race is getting the thing started. After you run 30 or 40 laps, you get so hot in the car that you can't breathe, and you can't even move your hand around on the steering wheel because it'll burn your hand, even with gloves on. It gets probably 130 or 40 degrees inside the car.
You still get excited?
Yeah, the reason I still do it is it's a high for Richard Petty, and I really, really enjoy driving the race car. I enjoy it better when I win, but, you know, I still enjoy driving the car.
And the win he enjoyed the most was the magical 200 at Daytona, July 4, 1984.
I was leading the race, and we was beating and bashing, and he'd be a little ahead, and I'd be a little ahead, and when I got to the line, I knew I was ahead, even though it was that close, within maybe a couple of feet.
The car kept on going until it got to the Smithsonian Institution as a prize piece of Americana, not only because of the 200 wins, but also because of the man.
If you mention 43 and probably 3/4 of the bars in this country, you won't even have to say Richard Petty.
Pete Daniels was born 60 miles from Level Cross. He's one of the Smithsonian's historians of the South.
We collect things for a lot of reasons. This particular car, because it represents a certain social history. And he certainly left a mark that not only as a driver, but as a folk hero among the people from North Carolina and the people from all over the country.
But that 200th win in 1984 was Richard's last. 154 races since then without a checkered flag.
What's been the hardest part about this long stretch of non-winning?
I guess the disappointments of going and doing and trying new things and thinking this was going to be the week and this is going to be the combination we need to win races, and it's just not come to be.
The nice thing, as far as I can see about your situation, is that you are still the king. You would still attract more attention than whoever this year's hotshot is if you went into a crowd. You've been able to maintain a position because there's some kind of difference, some kind of loyalty in the sport, isn't there?
Very much so. I'm in a unique position because I've been doing this 30 years. And the notoriety has just been there so long that the shine doesn't go away just because I don't win.
As a matter of fact, what with sponsorships and endorsements, Richard is making more money now than when he was tearing up the circuit. And it's not just Petty. Corporate America has discovered that one of the surest ways to move product off the shelves in the South is to connect it to stock car racing. And it's not just gas, beer, and chewing tobacco anymore. With the cost going up and money the only criterion for sponsorship, stock car racing has gone mainstream. This isn't a ketchup bottle. In fact, ketchup is the only thing connected with it that is supposed to go slowly. Barbara Behrman was in charge of marketing the stuff. What she found was that you didn't have to have Richard Petty to make stock car racing work for you.
I was told that you started interviewing women leaving stores. And one of the questions you asked was if Heinz sponsored a car, would you buy Heinz? And 18 out of 20 of them said yes.
That's pretty close.
Is that pretty close?
Yes, it was about 87%.
And that's what got you into this?
That's one thing, yes, definitely.
And are sales up?
Yes, they are. We're very happy to say.
Up enough to justify the money they spend as the major sponsor of a racing car that costs well in excess of $2 million a year to operate, and 2 to 3 times that to promote. You can buy a car like Richard's for $80,000 to $100,000. That's a lot of money for a car that calls itself stock.
Richard, if you stood back 10 feet and ignored all the signs, that could be a car in a Pontiac showroom. Does that mean it's a stock car race? I could bring my Mark 7 down here Sunday and enter?
Not really. It just looks stock. That's about the only stock thing about the car.
Well, tell me what's different.
All the suspension and stuff is heavier. The brakes are heavier. The shocks and springs are heavier. And, you know, your car's, for a 50-mile-an-hour car, this car's fixed to run 200 miles an hour, so a little bit different.
How fast have you ever driven this particular car?
These cars run somewhere in the neighborhood of 215, 220 miles.
Tell me about the inside.
The inside of these stock cars wouldn't pass any comfort tests. They're stripped down and crammed with safety features that have evolved through a lot of trial and error. Things like the window nets that weren't there in 1970 when Richard had a little accident down at Darlington.
Everything went in slow motion. I can remember it happened, and everything was really, really slow motion. You remember the car turning over and all this. And as the car would turn this way, my body would go that way, and my arm and everything was out the window.
This wall wasn't here then?
No, this wasn't here. This came about. The net came about, and this wall came about because of that. But anyhow, we wound up out in the middle of the racetrack there and dislocated my shoulder. But that was one of them bad days.
But if you don't want to take a chance on having one of those bad days that cars and drivers sometimes have, there are other ways to take advantage of the exposure big business can get in stock car racing. What you're looking at is the Gatorade 200, the centerpiece of Bill Schmidt's Southeastern marketing program.
Bill, every one of those cars down there, somewhere on it has a little Gatorade sticker, right?
Yes, sir.
And you don't get this called the Gatorade 200 because NASCAR loves you.
No.
That costs money.
Absolutely.
Promotion of the event costs money.
Right.
Promotion for things like the hospitality tents, where clients and customers can feel like part of the action and get a chance to sit in show cars. Cars that spend more time at supermarkets and shopping malls than they do at the track.
And it works.
It works. If it generates sales, it's a good thing.
And one of the best things in the sport for generating sales is Richard Petty.
When you like someone, like we like Richard, when you see his product, you buy it because it's Richard Petty, and you bring that home. Like I tried his barbecue sauce, I loved it, but I wouldn't buy it if it didn't have Richard on there. I buy his t-shirts, buttons, I buy everything because I like Richard. He's my favorite, so I just buy it because it's got his picture on it. And everybody does. I think they're just really loyal, and it's hard to explain loyalty, but I think race fans have more loyalty than anything I have ever seen.
Richard's always been a person, and you could really reach out and touch him. He was a touchable person. Some of these guys are not that way. So I think Richard was very special and always will be.
One more shot, Richard.
One more shot. These two didn't get in there. All right, guys, shoot quick.
Where we at?
Tom Cotter manages the stock car program for General Foods.
Being a spokesperson is probably more important than driving. 20 years ago, that was not the case. I'd say now that is paramount. That a person look attractive, be able to conjugate verbs, speak correctly in front of an audience, and be entertaining, and secondly, being a competitive race driver.
Oh, King Richard, just keep up the pace, your foot in the gas tank, and a smile on your face.
Petty still packs them in wherever he goes, like this department store in Chicago. He'll travel thousands of miles and make dozens of appearances in a typical year for his major sponsor, an oil additive he's been associated with for 18 years.
We should have had more police supervision. We're just not ready for the crowd that he's drawing today. Having Richard here was just to get the shoppers into the store, and he's doing a great job for us, especially on a Tuesday night when the place is usually empty.
With any driver, you always remember that the products that they're associated with, and if a driver uses it, obviously it's got to be a rather quality product. So sure, you pay attention to that.
Didn't mean to be late.
And it's not just consumers who pay attention to what Petty has to say. STP uses him to help motivate their regional sales managers.
Good evening. Good morning, whatever.
The man in charge of their marketing is Paul Negro.
What he does for us is try to get the guys excited, try to tell them how they can become winners and beat our competition. We think with his history as a race car driver, he's a perfect to do that. He's going through a program now where he's changing some of his mechanics, he's changing some of his aerodynamics and his motor, but not winning is really not the big thing. Richard Petty as a man is the thing that we want to sell.
What can you say about a man called the King?
He's a king just like Elvis. He's a legend. With 200 wins under his belt, there's probably not anybody going to catch him anytime soon.
With a winning position of a vanishing